Honorable Minister, Excellencies, Dr. Zerbo, distinguished guests and speakers, colleagues, students, dear friends. First of all, please accept our apologies for the delay, but we had, thankfully, more interest in this symposium than we had thought we'd have, so we had to add a few chairs there and then. Good morning to you all. On behalf of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion, I give you a warm welcome to this symposium, which is being held under the theme Pursuing Common Goals, Perspectives on Malta's Foreign Policy. My name is Alessandro Mangion, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your moderator today. But first things first, may I ask you to kindly switch your mobile phones to silent or vibrate, so that doesn't interfere with the discussions, and I thank you for that. I would also like to inform you that we have just been told that due to unforeseen circumstances, the former High Representative of the European Union for Security Policy and Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, will not be able to make it to Malta today. Did you know that the origins of the word symposium comes from a Greek word? Minister, as you know, whenever you meet former European Commission Dimitris Avramopoulos, he always tells you, tell me one word and I'll prove that it comes from Greek. And yes, even symposium comes from the Greek word for drinking party. Well, I don't want to disappoint you, but we'll actually be focusing on the talking part of that drinking party. Although, to tell you the whole truth, we will have coffee together and we will have lunch together later on. So at least we'll have a taste of that. So in a nutshell, today we will be engaging with His Excellency Lassina Zerbo, Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, who has honored us with his presence to discuss the search for multilateral solutions to global challenges. There will be also an opportunity to ask questions. Thank you, Dr. Zerbo, for returning to Malta after only a few months since we had the honor to welcome you on our island. Dr. Zerbo will be followed by two very interesting panel discussions. The first on women, peace and security, and the second on Malta and multilateral cooperation. Even there, we do encourage your active participation. At the end of the symposium, Dr. Norbert Bugeja, Senior Lecturer at the University of Malta, will share with us his thoughts on what we will have heard during these few hours together. You can find the full program, background information about our speakers, and the symposium concept note in the file you have received at the reception desk out there. But enough talk from me. Please help me welcome on stage the Honorable Carmelo Abela, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion of Malta, to deliver his opening remarks. Minister Abela.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you, and thanks for being here today for this symposium. I'm not going to delve whether it comes from Greek or not, but I'm pretty sure that what Sandro said is the truth after all, and we have a confirmation from His Excellency the Greek Ambassador present here with us. I would like to warmly welcome you all to this symposium organized by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion. Allow me to extend a special welcome to His Excellency Lassina Zerbo, Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, who is here with us today. Thank you very much. Malta is an island nation whose unique identity, traditions, and language have been at the center of each and every milestone of our history. Today, my country has evolved into a determined, resilient, and modern nation with its own positives and negatives, like any other nation in the world. This brings me to the current landscape in Malta. As you are aware, a person was formally accused of being the mastermind behind the brutal murder of Ms. Caruana Galizia. What we are witnessing is the rule of law in action, a country where nobody is above the law. We must also acknowledge that this moment in time, Malta is doing grounds on the international press for all the wrong reasons. Those of us here who are Maltese know deep in our hearts that this is not the Malta that we know, that this does not represent who we really are. As Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion, I am more than aware of the challenges that we have, and I am determined to do my utmost in this regard. As a country, in order to move on, we need to understand each other and work in harmony in order to arrive where we want to arrive. I am more than confident that, as we have done in the past, we will overcome the challenges that we have today. Therefore, we are confident that this is only a matter of time till our ship is once again steered to calmer waters. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Malta has grown from being the nurse of the Mediterranean to a country whose voice, outlook and vision for the future are a living example that size is just a concept. Our attitude is what drives us forward. Security and stability in our region have always been issues of priority for Malta. Since Helsinki in 1973, Malta has continuously underscored the principle of indivisibility of security, emphasizing that peace and stability in Europe are intrinsically and inextricably interlinked to peace and stability in the Mediterranean. 16 years later, global peace and security took center stage when, just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, US President George H.W. Bush and Soviet Union's leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in Malta on a stormy winter day. Yesterday, in fact, we commemorated the 30th anniversary of these significant events. The need for peace, security and stability in our neighborhood, the Mediterranean region, remains at the forefront of Malta's agenda to this very day. A peaceful resolution of the crisis in Libya, for instance, looms large for the future prospect of security at our southern shores. Malta's historical legacy, as shaped by foreign rule, has molded Malta's position as a bridge builder across the Mediterranean. Today's regional challenges have evolved considerably, and Malta firmly believes that initiatives in the Euro-Mediterranean region offer the suitable framework to address these challenges through dialogue and cooperation, with the final aim of reaching the full potential of the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean. As a European member state, Malta is a proud, active member of a union whose intrinsic values have contributed to stability, growth, and prosperity to the region. Firm in the belief that the European Union is the best platform to address the issues of all the member states, we have continued to underline that European solutions are required to solve European challenges. Equally, global issues require global solutions. This is not the time to eradicate the structures that have promoted cooperation and brought prosperity and stability for decades. On the contrary, we need to revitalize and refocus our efforts through multilateral endeavors which can secure lasting solutions. In the words of Kofi Annan, effective multilateralism is not an à la carte menu. As we look towards celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in 2020, We are aware that to ensure that its legacy lives on, we need to act now. To this, we cannot shy away from working together. Firm in this belief, Malta is seeking to serve the international community within the highest and most important bodies. Our experiences have taught us things that we believe can be valuable on the international level. Living on an island with few resources has not kept us back from achieving success in different fields. As a country whose aspiration is to promote peace and security, equality, social solidarity, Malta is seeking election as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council for the term 2023-2024. Prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian responses and post-conflict reconstruction remain at the core of the United Nations. While we all know that there is no magic formula, we also know there are elements that greatly increase the chance of achieving them. Giving women a central role in the peace process is a case in point. No country can hope to achieve a just and comprehensive peace if half of its population is excluded. Women and girls are also active agents of peace. Sustainable peace can only be achieved through women's economic and political empowerment, as well as their involvement in decision-making processes. Since Malta announced its commitment to adopt its first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security earlier this year, exactly in April, work is well underway. At a time when one of the greatest global challenges is the eradication of poverty, we are faced with the realization that more needs to be done to ensure the holistic implementation of Agenda 2030. Malta honors its commitment towards long-term sustainable growth in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, most particularly in the field of development assistance, with the aim of eradicating poverty by providing quality higher education and expertise, assisting also in building infrastructure and empowering the potential of women and youth in their personal development. In fact, Malta's official development assistance policy remains a central theme in our foreign policy, which has been strengthened by a revised ODA implementation plan that sets the basis for the country's official development policy through to 2030. For decades, Malta has also sought to be at the forefront on an international level in advocating the importance of protecting our natural resources. Through Resolution 43/53 put forward in the General Assembly 31 years ago, Malta, prompted by scientific evidence on the need to take immediate action to address global warming, played a key role in bringing to the attention of the world the urgent need to conserve climate in the interests of present and future generations. Identifying climate change as one of the major threats challenging our future today is a wake-up call that a collective effort following the Paris Agreement is not optional, but a must if we are to secure not only the achievement of Agenda 2030, but also a sustainable future for our children. Another major challenge of our times concerns the health and sustainability of our oceans, which are facing unprecedented stressors of human origin. Coupled with advances in technology, these are increasing the economic and geopolitical significance of our oceans. It is for this reason that we believe that an integrated and holistic approach to international ocean governance is more necessary than ever in order to uphold a sound multilateral system. We can't continue having 8 million tons of waste ending up in our oceans every year. As has happened in past occasions, we want Maltese winds to make global waves. As a result of this, an idea was born to hold an Ocean Ambassadors meeting in Malta, an idea that we took forward with support from the UN Secretary General Special Envoy, Ambassador Peter Thompson. Following the success of the first meeting of Ocean Ambassadors held in Malta on the 2nd of August of this year, we intend to take this initiative forward to make this a regular appointment for Ocean Ambassadors. Organizations as well, and other stakeholders to come together in a bid to save and future-proof our oceans. Taking stock of the ever-increasing interconnectivity, we are faced with the realization that industry is driven by now. It follows the mantra that actions are not taken because one can, but because one should. This proactive approach has provided the governments with unprecedented opportunities to harness growth and prosperity whilst embracing novelty and transformations. Malta decided to not stay idle and has sought to establish itself as the jurisdiction of choice for all types of innovative and avant-garde technologies, which led to Malta receiving the title of the blockchain island. Furthermore, today we are now in a position to explore artificial intelligence as a new economic niche, and we look forward to having Malta's name among the top 10 nations with a national AI strategy. Recognizing that trade is an important component in a country's foreign policy agenda, and firm in the belief that failure to maintain openness to trade leads to instability, Malta has over the past years sought to strengthen its trade policy, transforming it into one of the bedrocks of the country's foreign agenda. Through close ties with local economic entities and other ministerial departments, the country has seen an increase in delegations and institutional Maltese business meetings in partner countries. As I have personally stated in Shanghai last month, Malta has a lot to offer and is open for business and innovative ideas. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our foreign policy is a reflection of the direction our country is taking economically. Today's fast-evolving geopolitical environment introduces new challenges. Some of these challenges represent also opportunities. Malta is a strong player on many levels. We are an open economy that has expanded successfully over the four corners of the world. And in this context, we need to ensure that stronger political ties are established. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to gain prominence in Malta's foreign policy, and there is an endeavor to consolidate bilateral ties with sub-Saharan African countries, and testament to this is the fact that we have recently opened the High Commission in Accra, Ghana. Malta also recognizes the importance of Asia, and in this vein, Malta is also currently working on opening a diplomatic presence in Japan, with whom we have a trade surplus, and we hope that it continues like that. Efforts are also underway with a view to opening a diplomatic presence in South America. firm in the belief that despite the geographical distance between our two continents, we are united by historical and shared values, which provides a strong foundation on which to strengthen our relations even further. As can be attested, we are continuing to build a strong network bearing also the interests of our people in mind. I would like to thank once again Lassina for being here with us today, as well as all the panelists for the two panel discussions. Finally, this is only a small part of Malta's foreign policy, and I know that I took long, but this is only a small part of what we have to say and what we represent in our foreign policy. And the staff at the ministry, I know that they do much, much more than what I said. However, the central fulcrum of our policy remains our people. Each and every decision is taken with the best interest of our people and that of our international community at the heart. For it is our people that make a nation. My commitment is to continue providing the best to our people for a better quality of life and a brighter future. Sustainable development is all about current but also future generations, and not solely limited to specific economic sectors or social strata. A generation implies that we are all involved, and hence we are all expected to contribute to define our own future and to leave a better world to future generations. This is what fuels our foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Carmelo Abela, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion of Malta. So, our next speaker is His Excellency Lassina Zerbo, a national of Burkina Faso. During a professional career spanning nearly 25 years, he has developed expertise ranging from scientific and technical competencies to results-based management and multilateral diplomacy. For the past 6 years, he has served as the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, known much easier by the acronym CTBTO. Dr. Zerbo, the podium is yours.
Thank you and good morning. Your Excellency, Minister Carmelo Abela, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion, thank you so much once again for inviting me, and then thank you for your kind words. We had a discussion, I think 6 or 7 months ago, about the possibility of this symposium, and I promised to come, and then I'm here again in your beautiful island. But Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear students and dear friends, I wanted to acknowledge the presence of your ambassador in Washington, Kisa Zopardi. I think he's the one who introduced me first to Malta, and then his successor, Natasha Dole, he's the one who made it a reality for me to visit your beautiful island. So, Kisa, thank you for being here, and let me thank Natasha as well for doing a great job in Vienna with us. So indeed, it's a pleasure to be back in this beautiful island. And Malta, as Minister Abela mentioned, plays an important role in multilateral diplomacy, in regional diplomacy. And then I'm also happy that you mentioned your importance to deal with Africa by having a High Commission in Ghana soon. And it's so important because Malta has a lot to do with Africa, and then the link between Africa and Europe. And you and I have talked last time about how to deal with this issue. And then I thank you for the work you do, you and your government, and the government of Malta for making sure that this link or this trade or this interaction with the problem of immigration is dealt with the best way possible so that we can live in peace and harmony, because that's exactly what we want. So, on the occasion that we're marking today, which is the 30th anniversary of the milestone Bush-Gorbachev Malta Summit, which essentially marked the ending of the Cold War, this has brought the matter into even sharper focus. That is why I wish to use the opportunity to reflect further on what I believe is a common concern: the current trend in global policy making away from finding shared solution in favor of short-term transactionalist approaches. And I think that's something that Minister Abela mentioned as well. So let me start by saying that we already live in a globalized world. Interconnectedness and interdependence are not just buzzwords employed to explain how globalization will impact society in future. We are living the reality already of the global world with what I've mentioned, interconnectedness, and then the example of Africa, Malta, and African Europe is talking itself. But the rapidly advancing technology, new media, and communication tools that bring us together exist against an increasingly fragmented background. A deficit of trust has arisen in multilateral legal instruments and institutions as viable approaches to solving global challenges. Unilateralism seems to have taken hold of effort to seek long-term, durable solutions. This is particularly troubling in view of two truly existential issues facing humanity: climate change and nuclear threat. In my own field, the field of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, two main norms are today in grave danger: the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons and the norm of nuclear non-proliferation. The question we need to ask is, how can the international community come together to rebuild trust and strengthen faith in multilateralism to confront global challenges and thereby secure a more peaceful and prosperous world for the next generation? In examining this question, I would like to focus on four themes. First, opportunities and risks in the current geopolitical landscape. Second, the importance of diplomacy and multilateralism in addressing global challenges. Third, the role of regional institutions. And fourth, the role of science diplomacy. I think all those themes have been addressed somehow by you, Foreign Minister. So let me start by the opportunities and risks in the current global geopolitical landscape. The current spread of advanced technologies and the increasing availability of information present both inherent opportunities and risk. The growth in information warfare and cybercrime, as well as widely spread information and disinformation campaigns, illustrates the scope of abuses of communication and information technologies. Educational and economic opportunities have risen as more and more communities in the developing world gain access to critical information and training. But we have also seen a fragmentation of society where compromise and consensus have given way to extremism and polarization. In the nuclear field, my field, expanding access to nuclear energy for peaceful uses brings with its increased risk that nuclear technology and material could be diverted to military purposes. In this context, regional tension have also the potential to spark renewed consideration about the value of nuclear weapons in a country's security policy. While we see and feel the fractures every day in the news, we must also remember that we have, in many respects, long lived in a world of mistrust. But despite this, we have throughout the years also witnessed cooperation to reduce what were viewed as shared threats and risk. Perhaps the most recognized example of this cooperation was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even at the height of the Cold War, these two superpowers managed to forge mutually beneficial arms control agreement that served the interests of both countries and reducing the risks of war. Following the Malta summit in 1989, nuclear scientists from both the United States and Russia banded together to confront the monumental challenge of securing nuclear weapons technologies, material, and knowledge so that they would not be acquired by would-be proliferator or criminal entities. And so, while we rightly worry about the challenges presented by an apparent breakdown in trust in the field of arms control and non-proliferation, let us strive to use this to highlight the need to return to cooperative measures to reduce common risk. Second, the importance of diplomacy and multilateralism in addressing global challenges. If we are ever to advance our shared objective of a world of peace, security, and prosperity, we need to invest our effort and resources in building the case for multilateralism. The good news is that from climate change action to international development to arms control, many of these multilateral structures already exist. The more difficult part is making sure they stay protected and nurtured. Take the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, known as the NPT, for instance. The treaty and its system of safeguard have ensured the continued availability of nuclear power while reducing the risk of nuclear proliferation. Nonetheless, international nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime has come under considerable stress in recent years. This is due to a perceived lack of implementation of disarmament commitment by some states. Other states remain concerned about the ability of the NPT to adapt along with evolving proliferation risks. At the same time, the famous Reagan-Gorbachev doctrine that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought is now being undermined in public statement, scholarly work, and nuclear defense doctrine, and this is frightening. The NPT, however, remains one of the most adhered to treaties and continues to provide a forum for cooperation and debates on the collective goals of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, nuclear non-proliferation, and disarmament. State parties to the NPT will meet next year in New York for the 2020 NPT Review Conference, which will mark the 50th anniversary of its entry into force. The conference may or may not succeed in adopting a consensus final document on measures to strengthen the implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there are nearly 200 parties to the NPT that will continue to discuss and debate the most effective collective measures that can be undertaken to meet the object and purpose of the treaty at this forum. Despite all the problems, this is testament to the strength of multilateralism in confronting one of the greatest threats of global peace and security in our time. Third, I mentioned the role of regional institutions in rebuilding multilateralism. And Minister Abela mentioned Europe. And this was an example, and it's an example that I'm going to talk about. For me, the regional dimension of global governance will become increasingly important and influential in building multilateralism. My good friend Federica Mogherini, who was supposed to join us here in Malta, has no small part in this, of course. Her leadership brought a new vitality to the European Union's role on the world stage. Even with the stresses that some regional structures are facing these days, with the looming specter of Brexit being the most obvious, I believe that regional approaches can help rebuild trust in shared solutions. Regionalism is not a new phenomenon, of course. Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter expressly recognizes the role of regional arrangement and prefers certain disputes to be resolved through such organization before the Security Council becomes involved. Several regional mechanisms emerged during the Cold War, in part to insulate regional groups from the competition between the superpowers. Yet, this phenomenon has accelerated in recent time and has expanded in scope. Regional organizations that once mostly dealt with economic and trade issues are today important actors in non-traditional issues areas, including security, human rights, transportation, dispute management, education, environmental protection, and disaster management. Today, we see in regional organization a level of institutional creativity, innovation, and imagination that does not always exist at a global level. Most importantly, taking a regional approach allows citizens who can easily feel left behind by global governance mechanisms to directly connect with supranational decision-making processes. A good example is through the role of the European Parliament in the EU context. In this type of correction of the perceived democratic deficit in multilateralism, that will help counter the unilateralist approaches that so often appeal to populist sentiment. Now, fourth, the role of science diplomacy. And I was taken by Minister Zabella's giving Malta's example, and then you mentioned Malta showing scientific evidence, and then to move to the issue of climate change. This is exactly how science can help drive policy. For the past several decades, the use of scientific expertise to further diplomacy has achieved notable successes in advancing peace and security. There are plenty of great examples, from arms control instrument to the Paris Agreement on climate change. Despite the recent setback, there is plenty of scope for use scientific cooperation to help build the basis for multilateralism. As leaders who are invested in the values of science diplomacy, we need to think about how we can counteract short-termism and further boost the role of science and the role that science can play in solving problems that affect us all. In my view, the main contribution we can make is through the public promotion of science and investment into science, the communication of scientific approaches to problem solving, and above all, the encouragement of and development of capacity in access to science and technology education and training among the widest number of people possible. The latter especially means focusing on people in developing countries and on women and on girls everywhere. And as a gender champion, I've made it a priority. Not only the priority at work, but I don't have a choice at home because I have 3 girls and a wife, and then they bang on my head every day about the importance of girls and women. So I hope you sympathize with that, I wouldn't say the problem, but that solution that I have at home. So now talking to about the CTB2. At the CTB2, we are doing what we can to advocate for the role of science in policy making. our biennial science and technology conferences, and our science diplomacy symposiums, with the next one taking place in Vienna in March, April 2020, are important means of making a contribution. So too is our capacity building work with governments and institutions in developing countries, as well as our intergenerational outreach, the CTBT Youth Program. In conclusion, if we are to advance international peace, security, and prosperity throughout this next century and beyond, implementing effective multilateral solutions to global challenges must be the answer. This is as true in the field of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament as it is for climate change, sustainable development, disaster prevention and mitigation, and countless others. We must embrace multilateralism so that the next generation and the generation after that will enjoy beauty and diversity of the natural world around them, without fear of nuclear catastrophe or severe consequences of climate change. I will personally continue to play whatever small part I can, but I have no doubts that with the powerful voices from role models such as Malta, we will fix this currently fractured world. Thank you.
Dr. Zerbo, thank you so much for sharing your insights on seeking multilateral solutions to global issues. We do have time for questions, so I would like to open the floor for a short question and answer session. I'm not seeing much with lights, so we have roving mics. Who has a question? Who would like to start? Go first. There, please. Could you please identify yourself and put forward your question? Is there someone else from this side who would like to ask a question so that we already prepared the mic? Yeah, let's take the first question.
So, Excellency, thank you for your presentation and for your speech. I'm Dorian Farouja. I work at the Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Second Secretary, on global issues. If I may, I could ask you this following question. How does the work of the CBTO actually support
Office of Disarmament. But the CTBT has been set in a way where it has to remain an independent organization with its own governance. At entry into force, we'll have an executive council like OPCW in The Hague. That's a model that the CTBT is working in. But all the work we do should be governed by an executive council that makes decision with a two-thirds majority. And if you see what happened at OPCW during the problem of the chemical I wouldn't say incident, what happened in Syria. There was at some point a discussion between the role of the United Nations and then the role of the Executive Council of OPCW. This is exactly the model that the CTBT will play and the CTBTO at the entry into force of the treaty. So that when decisions are made, they're escalated to a point where at some point they can be taken to the UN Security Council. And we do report to the UN General Assembly every 2 years on our work and then where we stand on the development of the international monitoring system and the verification regime.
Another question? There.
Hi. Hi,
course.
my name is Corinne, and I'm a counselor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I actually have two questions that I wanted to ask you. In a recent interview, you recounted a very emotional, touching story where you were delivering a lecture in Japan, in Hiroshima, and the Japanese high school student wrote to you and said that during your lecture she was very touched. You subsequently invited her to Vienna for a science symposium, I believe, and during this, at this point, you had this very bright idea of launching a youth group. How do you see this youth group evolving? What future do you see for this youth group? And my second question is, in a recent tweet, you said that if we want to talk about Africa, Africa has to be at the table and not on the menu. In your capacity, what do you expect from the African Union? What more do you expect from the African Union in your line of work? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for making our work so relevant, because sometimes when we treat, we wonder whether it does reach exactly the people it should, and so that at least we can follow up. But thank you so much, and then thank you also for bringing the story of this very emotional situation. I lived in Japan when I was addressing an audience, and then there was a young girl, a student, crying in front, and then telling me how touched she was on the work that we do to stop nuclear weapon. And it's true, she was 16 at the time, and then I invited her to Vienna. And then when I invited her, I didn't know it would be that difficult, because she needed parental approval and the school approval, and then I got all kinds of beautiful letters from the school and from the parents. And then when she came to the symposium, indeed, we had the idea of launching the CTBT youth group. And there were 6 people at the beginning. That was 3 years ago. They're now 860 or nearly 900 now, I think, or at least I know for sure 800. And what they do for us, they make us relevant. And then they make the work of non-proliferation and disarmament even so and even more relevant, to a point where people realize that the younger generation care for their future. They care for the world, that they don't want us to prepare the world for them. They want to be part of what we want to prepare for them. And this is exactly what the CTBT Youth Group is all about. We're trying to bring young people to speak and talk what we can do, because we constrain by multilateral diplomacy and then state, because whatever I say, it's governed by 184 states that are party to the CTBT. But when young people talk, they're part of the civil society. They say what they want, they talk how they feel, and then they help us make a difference with the states that govern the organization. And we're trying to broaden the scope of the CTBT youth group, not to only focus on the CTBT, but in the overall aspect of non-proliferation and disarmament, but also in educational campaign to help them make a difference in their respective region. We have CTBT youth group members from Africa, young journalists. We're trying to get them to be able to spread the word of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, the importance of preparing a better world. And then they're now embracing many other issues like climate change. And when I travel, I was recently in New York, and then I met one of the CTBT youth group members who is now working at the World Bank. And she was telling me, I'm trying to convince the World Bank to do a youth group as well. And that's a great thing. So what will lead me to Africa is the youth group members in Africa. You know, I've often been told, what are you doing in this field, as somebody from Burkina Faso? And I've always told people that Burkina Faso should be part of peace building too. Same as Minister Abela was talking about the importance of Africa. And which leads me to the point you mentioned when I say, when you talk about Africa, Africa shouldn't just be on the menu. Africa should be at the table. What I meant by that is we often see discussion far from Africa talking about the future and the importance of Africa, talk about migration, talk about whatever God knows, and then Africa is not at the table. I was at a security conference recently in Halifax in Canada, and then people mentioned Libya. What happened in Libya? The decision to attack Libya was made without the African Union, and that's what I'm hearing everywhere in Africa. And today, the problem that Burkina Faso and West Africa is facing with terrorism, I'm telling you this morning, there are 15 people that were killed again in mad part of the country and due to terrorism. And that's something that we're living and facing because of the Libyan problem. Because there were a problem in Libya, and then that wasn't controlled after toppling Gaddafi, and then all the arms and all the weapons spread across West Africa, and then making it difficult for our government in that region to control the situation. And that's something that we have to deal with. But in talking about this, we have to bring Africa on the table, not just on the menu. That's what I meant. But when I wrote this tweet, or when I retweeted what somebody said that I said, I didn't know it would reach as far as Malta. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have time for one or two questions, I believe. Yes.
Here.
Okay.
Right here.
I'm Gerald Farrugia from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Malta. Thank you, Dr. Zerbo, for your comprehensive exposition here. I would like to ask, I was looking at the amount of countries that have signed this comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. But unfortunately, there are not as many sort of like endorsements of this treaty. And there are still some countries which are like completely left out of it. And some of these countries are nuclear heavyweights, so to say. So what else, or what more things can be done creatively to have this treaty more comprehensively endorsed by most of the countries in the world? Especially, obviously, those countries who have nuclear capabilities both for military and civilian use. And also something which is close to our heart is what you are saying about this people diplomacy. So how can like people in all the world be made more aware of the importance of having like a nuclear science which is more geared towards peaceful means instead of destructive measures that are used for this kind of debate. Thank you.
Thank you. With regard to endorsement of the CTBT, I think if you take a treaty that is signed by 184 countries, I mean, that's 95% of the world that is adhering to this treaty. So we have 168 that have ratified the treaty, and which make this treaty nearly universal. But you see, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is the only treaty that has a clause in its Annex 2 that requires 44 countries' ratification absolutely prior to its entry into force. There is no other legal instrument on this planet that has this sort of clause. And this clause was established assuming that 44 countries at the time had nuclear technology and potentially could be in the route to develop nuclear weapon if not stopped by the NPT. But here's the situation. Among those 44, 36 have ratified, and there are 8 remaining countries. And if you take the 8 remaining, we talk about regional issue, global problem, geopolitical tension, I can take them two by two. You take the United States and China. Those are the two remaining nuclear weapon countries under the NPT that have not ratified the CTBT. And they are two superpowers. So we working closely with them, and what we've achieved with them is already the great cooperation that we have, which is developing the international monitoring system in those two countries. US has completed all its international monitoring system facilities and contributing to the verification regime of the CTBT, and this is something that we appreciate and working closely with them. But you see, domestic politics is not something that we can interfere in. They have their own decision-making, their own treaty resolution, and then what we can do is to give them evidence, scientific evidence, and that's what we did, that the treaty is verifiable, that this organization is working, and that no nuclear test explosion can go undetected, so that could help convince them to ratify the treaty. And then I take in the Middle East, you have Iran, Israel, and Egypt. They've all signed the treaty as well, but they haven't ratified the treaty. We're working with all of them. We have, for instance, a workshop that we did in Jordan not long ago, where we brought experts from all those countries to sit around the table and then discuss issue of the CTBT, the technical aspect of the verification regime, and how we can move into convincing them or trying to be constructive in securing their ratification. And then the three others are India and Pakistan. They have regional tension between the two. Pakistan is an observer to this treaty. And then we hope that India will follow suit so that bilaterally they can make a decision and then come constructively towards the CTBT. And the last one is indeed the DPRK. And that's certainly beyond my paycheck, if I may say.
Dr. Zerbo, thank you so much for addressing this interesting and topic so thoroughly with us this morning. It is now time for our first panel discussion, which will focus on women, peace and security. At first glance, one may not necessarily think that the word women, peace and security belong together, as the words women and peace are generally traditionally associated with femininity and perhaps fragility. And the word security is seen as more masculine and strong. But I'll leave the discussion up to the experts. I invite one by one our distinguished speakers to the stage. Let's start with Ms. Francesca Gatt, Director, Global Issues and Focal Point on Women, Peace and Security at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion. Francesca will also be the lead discussant in this panel formation. Please welcome Dr. Anna Kaki, Head of the Department of International Relations of the University of Malta. His Excellency Patrick Duffy, Ambassador of Ireland to Malta. And Her Excellency Nada Graz, Ambassador of Egypt to Malta. So, Francesca, I leave this panel discussion in your able hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sandro. Is this on?
Hello.
Hello? Is this on? Yes. Okay. I would first like to introduce the panelists we have today. This morning have joined us Her Excellency Nada Graz, Ambassador of Egypt to Malta, a senior career diplomat, ambassador. She has served in many high-ranking positions, both at the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and abroad, including Paris and Tunis. Ambassador Graz is also a member on the board of the National Council for Women in Egypt, and her latest position was Ambassador and Deputy Assistant Minister for the Francophonie within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt. His Excellency Patrick Duffy, Ambassador of Ireland to Malta. He joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2000. He has previously served at Israel as Ireland's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York, the Consulate General of Ireland in Edinburgh, and the Embassy of Ireland in Brasilia. And he's also served in various divisions of the department's Protocol, Anglo-Irish, Human Resources and Communications units. And finally, not least, Dr. Anna Kaki, who joined the Department of International Relations at the University of Malta as a senior lecturer in 2001. And prior to her appointment, she has worked as a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and also holds a PhD in political science and international relations as well. So thank you very much for the three of you for joining us today on this panel discussion on women, peace and security. I'd like to give a bit of a context first regarding this discussion we have today. As some of you might know, next year the international community will be commemorating the 20th anniversary since the first adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on the topic of women, peace and security. This resolution reaffirms the important role played by women in prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian responses, and post-conflict reconstruction. Now, 20 years later, we have a number of other resolutions. The last resolution was, in fact, adopted only in October earlier this year. And there are actually two, let's say, batches of resolutions. One, which are only on women, peace and security agenda, but also another batch of resolutions which focus on gender-based violence. Now, all these resolutions, when they come together, they cover the core themes of the women, peace and security agenda. And to implement this agenda, many countries have implemented action plans, national action plans. So far, we have around 82 countries who have implemented national action plans. And what do these try to, through these action plans, governments strive to implement the agenda domestically, be it domestic violence, integration of minorities, human trafficking, peace and security as well. And Malta has also been working on its national action plan. In fact, as the minister said in his opening address, that we are at our final stages of coming to launch our first action plan. So that is the context of our discussion today. So I would like to start with a generic question, if I may. And especially when we are looking towards next year as the 20th anniversary of the Resolution 1325, how relevant is women, peace and security today, 20 years later? Ambassador?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me this morning. Asking your question if the agenda is still relevant nowadays, I would first like to start by saying that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a global historical construction, and it's the result of a century of women's peace activism. The Women, Peace and Security agenda will always be a relevant question, of course, as long as the international community is still facing all sorts of conflicts and crises, especially that it still has a very long way to go to achieve gender equality and women empowerment. And why I say so, because I believe strongly that gender equality and women empowerment are indispensable to finding the solutions for our new global challenges that we encounter now. When we talk about new global challenges, as we know, the global context of peace and security is constantly changing. We have in particular what we can relate to the rise of extremism and of terrorism. We have recurrent armed conflicts. We have increased number of refugees and internally displaced persons, and climate change, and so many other challenges. So actually, in response to your question, I would like to ask another question. As an attempt to answer yours, I would say, are we to wait for another conflict to erupt and then attempt to try to find the ways and means to solve it? I think we should not. And if I say that, it is because I believe that women are an eminent element in safeguarding peace and security. They are the ones who can prevent conflicts and can ensure peacekeeping and peace building. These are just a few thoughts I would have liked to share with you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Just, for sharing these thoughts. Ambassador Duffy?
Thank you very much, Francesca. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Just to complement as well what Ambassador Draz has said, I would concur that Women, Peace, Security agenda remains fully and always relevant. If we take a step back a minute and maybe look at some of the theory and the examples that have taken place around the world, research shows that pre-conflict societies are not gender neutral. This is not just a discussion in the context of conflict situations. If we go back to very, very basic first principles, and Francesca, we've spoken about this before, when you think about when a baby is born, what is the first question that people ask? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? Is that a pink card I'm going to have to get, or a blue congratulatory one? So I mean, that's an innocent little example, but it just shows that that is there from day one. And unfortunately, that works itself through as well to competency as gendered, and we see that, for instance, in the case of the DRC, whether it's the forced recruitment of boys and girls, boys as child soldiers, girls in terms of the cooking roles, but also like as sex slaves. So it's a regret to say, but gender does act as a multiplier of vulnerabilities. And maybe just to help bring this message home as well, I have a quote from Mary Robinson, who's our former president, but she's also has her own civil society foundation on climate justice, and she's chair of the elders. So more so in that capacity, she mentions that my approach to peace building involves not just political leaders, but all of civil society, including women. Without their full support and participation, no peace agreement can succeed. So I think, as Ambassador Draz says, that follows through then into terms of actions and women's participation across the board in the prevention of conflict, in managing the resolution of conflict, in being on negotiating teams, feeding into policy to end gender-based violence, having more female representation within our national systems, within UN systems, on peacekeeping missions, etc., gender mainstreaming through humanitarian actions. And in our foreign policy and our development policy, we aspire to include that. We don't have all the answers, but we're trying to look at it through that lens to make sure that that's taken care of at each step of the way.
Thank you, Ambassador Duffy. Professor Kaki.
Thank you, first of all, very much for having me here, Francesca, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with the two of you as well. Yes, no, I fully agree with the previous speakers that this is a very relevant issue, unfortunately, and that it's going to continue probably being a relevant issue. And if we look at the three core elements of women, peace, and security, so the first one being women in peacekeeping, taking a gender perspective to peacekeeping, we see that that is continuously relevant. If we look, for example, at violence committed, including sexual violence committed against girls and women by peacekeepers, it's not a problem that has gone away, but it's continuing as a real problem, and it's not really being addressed. Just to take one example, but I really had the possibility, unfortunately, to choose from many examples, but there were allegations of French peacekeepers abusing of young girls in the Central African Republic a few years back. There were allegations that were made to the UN, but in the UN they did not want to deal with this. This was not a UN peacekeeping mission at the time, and afterwards it was brought in front of the French courts, but the French prosecutors in 2017 closed the case because it was difficult for them to gather evidence. So we're far from a situation where this issue has been solved when it comes to a gender dimension to peacekeeping. The second core element of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is the protection of girls and women from sexual violence in particular. And this issue of protection generally has been on the table in humanitarian action and peacekeeping since the 1990s at least, so it was prior even to the adoption of the resolution 1325 in the year 2000, and it came with the wars in Bosnia, the genocide in Rwanda, etc. And what we're seeing here is that there is a lot more action being taken. So a few months ago, I was listening to the director of CARE, which is one of the large humanitarian NGOs globally, and he was talking about specifically their work in Haiti after the earthquake. So not a conflict context, but I will come back to the conflict angle later on. And he mentioned in particular one specific instance when after the earthquake there were thousands and thousands of people who had gathered in the large stadium, main stadium in Port-au-Prince. And he said, what we were doing, and this was after the earthquake when there was no food, there was no water, there was nothing. He said we worked day and night to get the electricity and the floodlights working in this stadium. And why do you think the floodlights? Because that would make girls and women safe at night. And he said that feeling, that sound in the stadium when they managed to get the flashlights back on, the floodlights, that collective sigh of relief he remembered from his work in particular. So that means that obviously this was a post-natural disaster context, but obviously CARE works a lot in post-man-made disaster context and war context, and there that protection agenda is more and more present. When it comes to the third core aspects of the classical women, peace and security agenda, that of participation of women in peace building, conflict prevention and conflict resolution. As a woman, I would like to say yes, of course, the agenda is very much relevant. As an academic, and the way that the agenda has been framed and how it is dealt with, I'm not as sure, but I'm hoping to get back to that later on in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaki. Now I'd like to maybe tailor-make a bit of a question for each of you. Ambassador Dratz, earlier this year, Egypt announced that it will embark to draft a national action plan. What prompted Egypt to do this now? Thank you.
Okay. So, first of all, I would like to say that Egypt has always been vocal on the promotion of the involvement of women in peace negotiations and in building their capacities in participating effectively in peace process and peace building and peacekeeping. And it is for this reason that we took the initiative early this year, actually it was in June 2019, to develop our first national action plan on the implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. Our national action plan is to be finalized in the first quarter of 2020 to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. The National Action Plan is being prepared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in cooperation with the National Council for Women and with the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peace Building, and of course with the civil society. Egypt has always supported the United Nations strategy on gender equality, and I can proudly say that we have achieved a lot on gender equality and women empowerment during the past 5 years. So it is really in light of this strong political will and being a major supporter and a contributor in the United Nations peacekeeping operations that we have been exerting enormous efforts on various levels to implement the Women Peace Security Agenda. Just to mention a few examples. Within these efforts, we have made efforts on the national level, on the regional level, and on the international level. On the national level, the National Council for Women plays a very important role in promoting the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. How do they do that? They do that by training courses, by specialized workshops, and by organizing campaigns. And I would like to mention here one of the most important campaigns that I have personally been participating in, what we call the knocking door campaigns. What is the knocking door campaigns? It is basically that you go to rural areas where women are not necessarily aware of what we are talking about, and they're not necessarily aware of the risks and the dangers of all the challenges to peace and security, and namely, I would say here, to extremism and to terrorism. And I think that this campaign has succeeded a lot in helping the awareness of these women, whether they are in the cities or in the rural areas, to understand the complexity and the important role that they have to do in order to protect their children from being influenced by these ideas. As for what we call the Cairo International Center for conflict resolutions, they have been at the forefront for regional efforts, for building African and Arab capacities in issues related to women, peace, and security. On the regional level, Egypt also actively participated with the drafting and the elaboration of the Arab strategy on United Nations Security Council 1325, Security Council resolution, bearing in mind, of course, the Arab context that is fraught with challenges of wars, terrorism, and extremism. On the international level, Egypt has also done a lot of efforts. I would just say a few examples. In 2016, we have submitted a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly to introduce a new item on the General Assembly agenda with regards to zero tolerance policy on sexual exploitation and abuse. In 2017, we proposed another resolution under the same item entitled Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, implementing a zero tolerance policy. Later on, in 2018, we have organized the first meeting at the United Nations in New York to discuss establishing networks of women mediators in order to exchange experiences, best practices, and lessons learned to promote the contribution of women in peace negotiations. Egypt is also already an active member of the African and Mediterranean networks concerning these women mediators. I would like also to mention that our president was one of the first leaders to join the United Nations Circle of Leadership on the Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse in the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Finally, in 2019, last March, during the Peacekeeping Ministerial Conference, Egypt pledged to reach a 10% of women in each deployed formed police unit by 2020. And so this is a target, and we are working on it. So in light, I think, of all these efforts that have been done, whether it was nationally or regionally or internationally, in order to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it goes without saying, of course, that we had to prepare our own national plan of action. And we are keen on joining the other countries that have already achieved this target. I think there are 82 countries by now, so Egypt is going to be the 83rd.
and we'll be the 84th. We'll be the 84th.
Well, so I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, definitely. You gave us a really broad overview of all the ongoing efforts and also a contribution that Egypt has given WPS. Ambassador Duffy, we know that Ireland is now well in its third National Action Plan being implemented. And therefore, if you have to look back to the first National Action Plan and to today on this, what has been the changes in the public opinion? Has it is Irish public opinion better versed in what WPS is about? And was this because of all the actions and efforts done all throughout these years?
Yes, I would say so, in the sense that now, well, last June we launched our third National Action Plan, and I suppose key tools along the way have been consultation and communication. While the first resolution, as you say, was from 2000, our first National Action Plan only came in 2010. So again, I think it was just that kind of groundswell that this is something we really, really need to be doing. And it was our former president and the head of the Climate Justice Foundation, Mary Robinson, who made the case to government about this is a space we really, really need to be in. And so we started in 2010 with a cross-learning exercise between the experiences of Liberia, Timor-Leste and Northern Ireland. And we've gone from there. We are on our third. Each iteration learns from what's gone before. I mean, we don't say we have all the answers, and a lot of it is quite specific to our experience. But that said, I know colleagues involved in this sphere are engaged in lesson sharing and the like. So as I mentioned, consultation and communication have been key tools to getting us to where we are and raising that awareness. Just to focus on the most recent exercise, NAP 3, National Action Plan 3, was organised around a working group which involved an external independent chair, and then 50-50 participation, representation, government and civil society. Extensive consultation process, public process. 49 submissions were received to the written public consultation. 3 consultative workshops took place, one in Dublin. I mean, this isn't a capital-centric project, and 2 outside the capital, and with over 200 participants from statutory bodies, civil society and academic participants. So it's important as well, I suppose, to draw on our own national experience in this sphere and the work of the likes of the Women's Coalition, who were engaged so closely and successfully in the peace process in Northern Ireland, which helped in turn bring about the Good Friday Agreement. And I suppose they were starting from a blank canvas. I mean, it's not that they were being ignored, but they weren't being asked into the process. I think it's just they weren't thought of, but they gathered and they made the case. They fought for their place on that negotiating table, and people listened to what they were saying. They had a perspective that was different to the reasons why things the way they were, but also the solutions. And they've been a fixture in the process ever since, and engage in lesson sharing exercises. Most recently, earlier this year, carried out a mission to Cyprus. I suppose one thing at the national level and in terms of raising awareness too, we see that it's on the government side, it's cross-government. It's not just because Department of Foreign Affairs are running the process that they're the only ones who have actions, or they're the ones who tell the others what to do, because that just doesn't work. So it's been a matter of bringing all the stakeholders in together and sitting down, and it's the representatives of the Foreign Ministry, the Justice Ministry, the Defence Ministry, the Employment Ministry, Rural and Community Development, the Defence Forces, the Police Service, the Health Service, to have everyone together and how they can see their actions. And it was quite interesting because, especially at the beginning, this was a new concept to everybody, and someone had to be the one taking the lead and explaining. So it was the Foreign Ministry, but then just sitting down with the stakeholders, they realised that they're actually doing a lot of the actions in any case that speak to the women, peace and security agenda. So it's about, systemising that and putting it together under this new heading. I would say as well that Ireland's, we've taken a proactive and I suppose a lead role in the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Agenda. With South Africa, we co-chaired the process with Kenya, we co-chaired the process that brought us to over the line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, there was very good communication with the public at home on that, and schools and everyone just waiting for the outcome. And there's a legacy there now that, as part of what kids learn in school, is what are the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm proud to have Ireland as part of that. And I think in the way it's taught as well, it's like I was at the United Nations during that period, and it was I think it's a success that sometimes the lofty process of negotiations has actually been communicated well down to the ground roots, and people can see, for instance, how the mutual reinforcement between the goals, such as Goal 5 on gender equality and Goal 16 on peace, justice and strong institutions, that's been brought home very clear. And then in terms of specific actions as well, on the domestic front, we're looking for maybe increased female participation in the defence forces. A lot of funding has been spent in that regard with mixed success. I mean, there's wider issues around retention, etc. But then we see the importance of that in terms of mixed gender deployments, for instance, in the missions that our naval forces made in the context of Operations Pontus and Sophia here in the Mediterranean, and for when people are rescued from sea, that they're in such distress and that they can be spoken to by someone of the same gender, and that those kind of actions go a long way. Or in where people register in Ireland in the different centres, that there's leaflets there in their own language. That all goes away a long way to bridging the communication gap and raising awareness. That's been our experience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Duffy. And Professor Kagi, when we are talking about implementing national action plans, of course, it's not only about government and ensuring that governments, different ministries are involved. It's also about all stakeholders. We talk about civil society, academia as well. How can civil society and academia be more involved in the process of WPS?
Okay. That's an interesting question, and I know that, and as you mentioned, civil society and academia have been involved, and I read a PowerPoint earlier by one of your colleagues, and it was actually prepared in preparation with someone from academia, I believe.
Yeah.
So there are these close interlinkages. However, the role of academia and the role of civil society are quite distinct. Often they tend to be lumped together, but they are quite distinct. So I would say that academia has more the role of being a grain of sand or a grain of salt, or that kind of doubt in processes where one would like to have certainties. It's a little bit our role to have that distance and to try to poke at the arguments made. So often it's quite different from that of NGOs and civil society, because civil society will have a cause. So they will be certain of a particular cause, what they want to pursue and what results that is going to have. So if we take the case of more liberal-leaning NGOs, and I will use the example of a Swedish NGO, Kvinna till Kvinna, which is one of the main NGOs working in this sector. It was founded by in the 1993 during the wars that were ravaging former Yugoslavia, and it was in response to the atrocities of, in particular, sexual violence that were being committed in that part of the world at the time. The key guideline is we see gender equality as a prerequisite for peace and sustainable development. And this is what guides their action. So gender equality is the basis for peace and sustainable development. It makes a lot of sense from an NGO perspective. From an academic perspective, I would say, well, is it really the case that gender equality is necessary in all instances for peace, however much I would like that to be the case as a woman, or for development? We're not talking about sustainable development, but because no country globally has really achieved sustainable development to date. But I would as an academic, the role is quite different. If we then take the example of an illiberal NGO and civil society organization, because often we presume that NGOs and civil society are a liberal lot, but for example, there are excellent academic writings about the international gun lobby. So we think of the gun lobby as something American, and an American organization that is working mainly to affect politics in the US. But in fact, that gun lobby also works internationally and was quite successful in trying to change gun laws and make them more liberal in a country such as Brazil, a large country. And their argument would be that that guns make families safer, that guns help protect a family from outside violence. And here again, as an academic, I would say, well, actually, no, that's not exactly the case, because guns in families tend to lead to more accidental death of children, and it tends to be used in domestic violence and lead to the death of women in those contexts. So academics might be activists in their free time, and we don't have to go very far to see examples of that. But in their academic role, they're supposed to have a sort of a more critical approach to all claims of truth, however noble they find the cause to be behind it. So I guess my role here, and that's how I would, like the last remarks I would want to make, is to sort of bring a bit of more complexity and potentially new angles to this issue. The first thing I wanted to discuss is that of the definition of women, peace and security, because it started out as a rather narrow concept focused on, as I mentioned earlier, the issue of protection from sexual violence, peacekeeping and the role of women in peacekeeping, and the participation of women in conflict resolution and conflict prevention. And it has been broadened out quite substantially since then. So if we look at, there's a Georgetown Index on Women, Peace and Security, which is put together with PRIO, which is one of the most active think tanks globally based in Oslo, on this agenda. And their index contains anything from women's average year of schooling in each country, looking at even women's cell phone use, so mobile phone use, women's participation in the economy, but also questions of public safety and war and peace. So what we're seeing is a broadening of this agenda, and there are questions around that. When we broaden out, that's a response to a concern, but where does it leave us? How does that then overlap with the Sustainable Development Goals, with other agendas? So that's the first point I wanted to bring out. And if I may, the second point would be regarding the fact that this agenda was, of course, sponsored by the UN Security Council. So it is a state-led agenda and a diplomatic agenda, both at the bilateral and the multilateral level. And this has been extremely positive in certain ways, because it has helped to give this issue a lot of prominence. It has also helped to give that very strong impetus to make this agenda mainstreamed across important aspects such as peacekeeping, such as humanitarian action and development action. And there's a lot of efforts in programming, in projects, in declarations to have that perspective in mind. However, it can also be negative in some other ways, and that brings me back to the comment I made earlier regarding women in peace building and peacemaking and conflict resolution, because intrinsically any effort at peace building and conflict resolution in particular will be deeply political. Conflicts are always very, very political, and the conflict resolution will always be very political. And here, women might take stances which a more apolitical technical approach, which tends to be the one preferred by the UN and diplomats, will not really fit that well. So what we might see is that women might find that to make this agenda their own, it is they would like to take a Marxist perspective on peace building, or they would like to take a perspective where they would want men to come back to a benevolent, protecting role of a traditional society. That might actually be the case in some instances, or they might have a quite staunchly anti-colonial stance. And there again, that will often put them ill at ease with a multilateral diplomacy, which will tend to be a little bit smoother on these kinds of issues. When I read up on the agenda yesterday, I came across an example from 2003. There was a meeting in Geneva, I believe, just in the wake of the attack of the US and the UK on Iraq, and there was an Iraqi women's delegation that had been invited to Geneva to talk in front of delegates that were active on the 1325 agenda. And they were very angry. They were very angry about this invasion, and that did not come across very well with the delegates, because that's not how you talk at the UN. So that would be my last point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaki. Now I would like to open the floor for a couple of questions. We have some time.
And Dr. Mukwege, of course, very much exactly about this issue, highlights the importance of this. But my question is this: I believe there were 9 resolutions on women, peace and security since 2000, 20 years, and seeing that there's 85% of peacekeepers are in Africa, what, from your experience, what would you say has been the most tangible result from these resolutions? Thanks.
Is there another question? Maybe we take 2 questions. I'm not seeing ones. Actually, yes.
Hello, good morning. My name is Maria Calleja. I'm Director General, Political and EU Affairs. First of all, I would like to congratulate the panel. I was really enticed by what Ambassador Nada Drat said about knocking doors. And I would like to refer to the fact that 82 countries already have national action plans since 2000, and that UNSCR has been 1325 has been with us for 20 years, as Francesca said earlier. What more can we do? Has this been any successful in any way? What stock has been taken of where women stand today? The fact that we are speaking about it today still means that in 20 years our achievements may have not been that successful. And looking at a number of countries, with the exception of a few, perhaps in Europe, possibly in the north of Europe, we have not been, we are not there yet. We are not even close. What about the tapping on the shoulder? Are we helping women to realize that they have potential and that it can be used? The European Union has come a long way, for example. I'm very pleased to note, as many are, of course, that the Commission is now led by a female president of the Commission, and she has made sure that half of the commissioners are female, or at least almost half. So that's a step forward. Are we choosing women to take leadership roles so that women allow other women to take other leadership roles, and then that filters, of course, in peace, security, peace building, conflict resolution? I don't think that we are doing the effort much enough. I don't know what the panel thinks, and my question is, what can the UN he for she solidarity movement do in this in these circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be taking these 2 questions. I will maybe start with a couple of observations myself, and then feel free to, because we soon have to wrap up. As regards Africa, I think earlier this year in October, I think we saw Africa's response to women's peace and security. The fact it was South Africa who put forward a resolution on women, peace and security in October, actually was, it was it had never been done before, because in the past it was always the EU non-permanent member on the Security Council that would take this dossier forward. So in having a resolution being pushed by South Africa was a first, and this is actually something which is to be applauded. As regards, and I'll leave it at that, then maybe I'll say something of it just to conclude later. Ambassador Draft.
Yes, I would like just to reply to Ambassador Maria Correa. Thank you very much for your comment. I really, how would I say that? I really agree with many of what you have said. What could we do more? Coming from my region, from Egypt, from Africa, from the Arab world, with all the challenges that we are encountering, I think that the key answer to this is mainly two things: education and awareness. Because this is the start of everything. If you do not educate women and men both together, that empowering women is something essential for the how would I say, for the best of the society, we were not going to do much. It takes both of them. And that's why I here insist again and again on education. You have raised also another question, which is it concerned about women leadership. There is an old saying that says that women are the worst enemies to women. But I totally disagree with this one, because from my personal professional career, I have always worked with women. I don't know why, but since I started as a very junior diplomat until very recently, and I can tell you also that it will boil up at the end about also education. And from education you will have your self-confidence. Why would women be not encouraging each other? It is only because it's a question of self-confidence, I think. So I thank you that you have touched on this particular issue. And once again, I think it is awareness and education for both, for the two components of our society, which are men and women. Thank you
very much, Ambassador. Ambassador Duffy?
Yes, and thank you for the questions. And just to concur as well, look, I mean, a lot has been done in the past 20 years, but clearly a lot more to be done. I mean, I take some solace in the fact that it seems that the Women, Peace and Security Week at the UN goes from strength to strength. The Open Security Council debates on this topic appear to be the most overly subscribed, and they talk long into the night. But as you say, yeah, it's to match it with the actions and with more and more countries coming on stream with their national action plans to get that message out there. In terms of, yes, just full concurrence with the points around education and how to leverage the environment, the atmosphere that is out there now. Education is key to that, and as we say, it's not just for women and girls, it's for men and boys as well. Education is a key component of our development policy, and including in conflict-affected settings, where we propose to spend 250 million euros between this year and 2023, exactly trying to address these issues and create the generations where this will just be taken as a given. Also, there's issues around creating opportunities for women in leadership roles, including them in delegations, etc. We've started a process whereby we have youth delegates attached to our UN national delegations, and up to now anyway, they've always included women too. And yeah, key as well, strengthening women's voice in political process. And again, that from what we can do at a national level or through our aid is to fund leadership initiatives on a global scale. I would say, go back to what we said at the beginning, it remains fully and always relevant. At the end of the day, a focus on this subject, it saves lives. We look at the the situation around the Ebola outbreak in the DRC in June 2019, where once again most of the victims were female. And that echoes what happened in the outbreak in Sierra Leone. And the data suggests that the lack of sex-aggregated data meant that women once again were the most fatalities. And why was that? That's because women are seen as the carers, and they're the first to go and respond to a relative, a friend in need, and then to be infected. That was something identified in the outbreak in West Africa, but unfortunately that learning didn't carry through to the next outbreak. So yeah, ultimately it comes down to that, it saves lives.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kafi, quickly.
Yes, I will just say quickly. I think that there's a lot that remains to be done, but I think that this resolution was extremely important. I read a few years back a memoir called A Wartime Memoir by a Hungarian, now a psychiatrist, who had undergone atrocious sexual violence in the later stages of the Second World War. When she was in Eastern Hungary, she ended up being left behind by her family. And when she returned to Budapest after the war and she was starting to tell her mother about what had happened to her, she couldn't have children, she was really in a bad state. Her mother said, this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen to women of our sort. And of course, she didn't speak about it for decades since. So I think that this resolution, by showing that this is a universal problem and that it is universally condemnable and reprehensible, is a very good beginning. And in that sense, I think in and of itself, it's a strong thing to have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaki, and thank you very much to the three of you, Ambassador Dratz, Ambassador Duffy as well, and of course you, Dr. Kaki. Just a couple of points just to conclude. Of course, the WPS agenda is far from perfect, but it has the potential to be a transformative agenda. It has a great potential. And I think sometimes we talk about leadership with a capital L, right? You know, leading delegations, leading this, but actually we need to maybe speak about leadership with a small L, talking about how women are on the front lines of conflict, of dialogue, of humanitarian access. And we have seen it all. We've seen it in Yemen, Nigeria, Colombia, Libya. So it really goes to show that if everybody comes together, the governments, the United Nations, civil society, the private sector, all actors together, then we can actually achieve much more for peace and, of course, at a global level. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much for here. So Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Francesca, the members of the panel. So we have Francesca Gatt, Director Global Issues and focal point on women, peace and security at the Ministry, who was also lead discussant of this formation. Dr. Anna Kaki, Head of Department of International Relations at the University of Malta, His Excellency Patrick Tuffy, Ambassador of Ireland to Malta, and Her Excellency Nada Dratz, Ambassador of Egypt to Malta. So now it's time, ladies and gentlemen, for a 30-minute coffee break. It's the drinking part of the symposium. It's in the foyer outside. Afterwards, we'll come back to a very interesting as well panel discussion led by Professor Carmen Sammout on Malta and multilateral cooperation. See you later. So, welcome back to the symposium. It's time for our second and last panel discussion, which will focus on Malta and multilateralism. I think some mics are on. Okay. Malta strongly believes that a rules-based global multilateral system is the most effective way of promoting peace, prosperity, and security throughout the international family of nations. This is even more so in the globalized world of today, which is facing severe common problems which Malta believes cannot be solved by any one single country alone, irrespective of size and power. So the lead discussant of this panel is Professor Carmen Sammout, Pro-Rector and Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Malta. And Professor Sammout is joined by Professor David Attard, Director of the International Maritime Law Institute, better known as IMLI, and Ambassador Alan Deidoun, Malta's Ocean Ambassador, and last but not least, Ambassador Carmelo Iguanes, our former permanent representative to the United Nations in New York and Ambassador Designate of Malta to France. Carmen, I leave it in your able hands to steer this discussion.
Thank you, Sandro. It was a great pleasure this morning to follow the panel on women, peace and security, and that the issue of women's underrepresentation was brought up even in this forum. I happen to be chairing a technical committee that is looking into the underrepresentation of women in our parliament. At the moment, we stand around 10 to 12%. I think that with the appointment of Commissioner Dalli at a European level now, the number has actually decreased. So this is an important theme at a national level, and we're far from achieving the 2030 UN Agenda and Goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals. But let us move on to our subject. Small states are known to be important players in multilateral fora, and Malta is a member of several international organizations, most notably a member of the United Nations since our independence, and then from 2004 onwards as a member of the European Union. There are some important historical points which were mentioned some of which were mentioned by the Minister this morning, but I would like to underline some other points. In 1968, Malta raised the question of aging as a matter of international concern in the United Nations, which opened the way for the World Assembly on Aging during the General Assembly of 1982. Later, the UN Economic and Social Council, by its resolution 1987-41, recommended to the UN Secretary General the establishment of the International Institute on Aging. On the 9th of November 1987, the United Nations signed an official agreement with the government of Malta to establish the International Institute on Aging as an autonomous body under the auspices of the United Nations. The institute was inaugurated in 1998 by the UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar. Malta has served once in its history between 1984 and 1985 in the UN Security Council. At the moment, it is vying for this position from the year 2023-2024. At the moment, as we speak, Malta holds one of the vice presidencies of the 74th United Nations General Assembly. And then there's also the issue of UN climate change action. During the summit last September, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a landmark report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And these developments came at a time when our attention is turning more and more towards the links between oceans and climate. 52 years ago, as the Minister mentioned earlier today, Malta's first permanent representative to the UN, Dr. Arvid Pardo, put forward a proposal to the United Nations General Assembly declaring that the seabed, the ocean floor and subsoil are common heritage of humankind. At that time it was mankind, but now I think we have all accepted the principle of humankind. The aim behind this proposal was to seek to promote good governance and the sustainable and peaceful use of the ocean and its resources. This initiative paved the way for the deliberations that led to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, ITLAS, is the judicial arm of the UNCLOS, and Judge Professor David Attard has been the Vice President since 2017, and I know that you're now coming up for re-election. You'll be seeking re-election in June 2020. So let us start our discussion actually by looking at maritime law, and my question is whether it is suitable to face modern day challenges brought about by climate change.
Well, thank you, Pro-Rector Zamoud. First, if I may, congratulate the Ministry for this very interesting forum. Perhaps it is significant that 55 years ago, in fact on the 9th December, the Maltese Prime Minister made his first speech to the United Nations. And I think the speech was rather important because, having analyzed the speeches made thereafter by Prime Ministers of Malta, the contribution of Malta emerges and reflects the commitment that Malta and its diplomats show towards the common good. In fact, Malta has a very small diplomatic corps, but it does far more, achieves far more, in my opinion, than the size of its diplomats' body. I am particularly pleased that you asked me this question because I have been in one way or the other involved in the two issues over the past 30 years. To my mind, there can be no effective ocean governance and protection unless we protect the global climate, and vice versa. Because of the interdependency of these two systems, there can be no proper protection of the climate unless we protect the oceans. Now, we all know that the phenomenon of climate change exists, that it is threatening the existence of mankind, and that, in fact, humankind has managed to tamper with the ecological system which nature has taken millions of years to develop. Never in the history of civilized man have we seen this threat to the fragile ecological system that we all depend on. Now, the question reminds me, having drafted the first resolution on climate change in 1988, when I have to say I faced widespread opposition at the time. States were not quite sure whether they wanted a convention. In fact, I had to amend the draft a number of times to come up with a consensus. But then with Mustafa Tolba, the executive director of UNEP, and Obasi, director general of WMO, we set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I think put the issue in a proper scientific perspective, making it difficult for states to deny, although today there seem to still be some states in denial. But nevertheless, the truth is that this was 1988. 6 years after the adoption of the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, which, as you rightly pointed out, was inspired by our ambassador's speech in November 1967 to the UN. The truth is that this convention, that was the product of the longest diplomatic conference in the history of mankind at that time, was unaware of the problem of climate change. And therefore, the truth is that we have a constitution of the ocean which is remarkable, which has over 300 articles, but which does not deal with this issue. This brings, of course, a challenge to the people and bodies responsible, because the oceans and climate, as I said before, are very deeply interrelated. Sea level rise, ocean acidification, CO2 sinks, these are all related to the relationship between climate and oceans, and therefore they have to be recognized as a fundamental solution to the problem of climate change. In some respects, to my mind, one of the important roles of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg is actually to look at these challenges to the stability of the Convention. And I'm very pleased to say that we have set up a working group to look at the problems of sea level rise, the legal issues. Does a sunken state still generate an exclusive economic zone? Does sea level rise affect the baselines which have been accepted and therefore the sovereignty of the state? These are all fundamental issues that are going to be facing humanity. And let me make this clear. Most people seem to think that this is a problem of the Maldives and the problem of Kiribati. Well, not quite. There are mega cities that will be affected by sea level rise. The Nile Delta, for example, a very important source of wealth, could be threatened. And therefore, my view is that international maritime law is currently immature to deal with this huge phenomenon which we are facing. If you ask me what initiated my interest in advising the Malta government in '88 to raise this at the United Nations, was precisely this. And that was that I saw a massive ecological problem. But as an international lawyer, I was extremely concerned that international law did not have the mechanisms, the tools, to deal with this challenge to the planet. And frankly speaking, much progress has been done since the Maltese Initiative of '88, but we're still a long way back. Now, this is a personal view, but I think that we are relying too much on the economic solutions. I believe that states would do well to look at an initiative taken by the former Prime Minister of France, Rocard, where we were, 12 of us were summoned to work out the Hague Declaration, which was at the time adopted by many heads of state. And we have to look seriously at climate change and our perspective in evaluating sovereignty in the contemporary world. I think it's very important for us to look at a fundamental principle, that sovereignty can no longer be used as a facade if you have activities that are threatening the global climate. I believe that cooperation is of fundamental importance. Secretary General of the United Nations gave an admirable speech in Madrid where he sounded the alarms, which in effect was really a reflection of his concern expressed a few weeks ago at the climate summit, We are just not up to it. And therefore, to rely on the current mechanisms, I think, and I know this is a major task, but I believe that more has to be done in terms of developing legal tools rather than relying on simply the economic mechanisms that are being put forward as a solution to climate. I end with this note. The global climate was declared in 1988 by the General Assembly as the common concern of humankind. That was a development in the legal thinking. Since before 88, international law recognized the common concern of all states. But in climate, the General Assembly went a step further. Humankind is concerned because climate is or rather human life is dependent on a viable climate. And therefore, I believe that given the absence of climate change in the 1982 Convention, more and more work has to be done in developing legal response strategies. To my mind, this is possible if there is cooperation. But there are other strategies which perhaps I can refer to later, which are not dependent exclusively on just legal regulation. I was the first chairman of the legal committee of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I remember in those days we were looking at things as efficiency, adaptation, and perhaps I will speak about them later. But I'm pleased to say, first, I wish to congratulate the Foreign Ministry because Malta was elected to the IMO Council. I think it came second after Singapore, which is quite a remarkable feat, I have to say, particularly given the size and the fact that Malta cannot lobby to the extent that larger states can afford to do. But I believe that this is a major achievement by the Foreign Ministry. But also I wish to say that for many years, shipping was left out of the Paris framework. And now I'm pleased to say that IMO is now taking action, particularly on ship source emissions. And this is going to be a very major achievement because IMO works on the premise of legal regulation. So sooner or later, you can't have ships entering ports if they do not respect, for example, the sulfur directive of IMO. So to conclude, I must say, I think international maritime law is currently immature to deal with the massive problem humanity faces. We need to work together to cooperate more to find solutions that will affect both the well-being of oceans and climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Attard. I have to say that Professor Attard is the director of IMLI, the International Maritime Law Institute, and also happy to say that he is the chancellor of my alma mater, so we usually meet during graduation ceremonies at this time of the year. Now, let us move on to another colleague of mine, Professor Alan Daydoun, who is Malta's ambassador, ocean ambassador, actually. My question is, what is the main value of the Ocean Ambassadors meeting?
Okay, so thank you, Pro-Rector and distinguished guests. First of all, I would like to start addressing this question by actually addressing another key point which comes to people's mind when we mention the term ocean ambassador. You know, when you tell people, listen, I'm an ocean ambassador, they actually stare at you blankly, quite blankly sometimes, and they say, why do we need actually an ambassador for the ocean? And Malta is actually one of 6 countries worldwide to have an ocean ambassador. And I reply by saying, you know, we're simply ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the ocean. Why do I say this? The ocean is the 7th largest economy in the world. So it would make it easily into the G7, you know? So in terms of ecosystem goods and services that we're getting from the ocean, we're looking at something which goes in the trillion. But at the same time, we ignore the role that the ocean plays in our everyday lives. For instance, every second breath we take doesn't come from trees, but comes from the ocean. Those microscopic plants floating around in the ocean, okay, phytoplankton and so on. We always think of trees on land when we speak of the air that we breathe. Things are changing, as Professor Attard rightly said. In fact, now in Madrid, at the climate meeting, it's being dubbed the Blue COP, in fact. Why the Blue COP? Because there are these intrinsic links between climate and the ocean. And I always avoid the trap of using the oceans. We rather speak of the ocean today in recognition of the connections between the various seas into one single ocean. But coming back to your question, last August, as Minister Abela rightly said in his opening speech, Malta took the bold step of actually convening this first Global Ocean Ambassador Forum. And why did Malta take this bold step? At the moment, when we speak of the ocean, there's a lot of initiatives going on by several different entities, several different threads going into the same direction. So you've got, chief of these, you've got the BBNJ conference process. I'm not sure how many of us are actually aware of what BBNJ stands for. It's quite in my opinion, a sad choice for an acronym because it's not very inspiring. You know, when you say BBNJ, it's quite a mouthful. But obviously, we're speaking about 50 to 60% of the planet, i.e. the high seas. So that brings me back to the elephant in the room. We focused so far in these past millennia on the 1/3 of this planet, on land. All our economic activity are based on land, and so us in the northern hemisphere, we're almost on the step of winter. The next time we'll speak about the sea probably is in June, when we'll don our bathing costumes and so on. You know, so the Ocean Forum was a way of getting all the entities worldwide which have a role, you know, which are playing a role in the BBNJ conference process, which is trying to come up with a legal framework to actually regulate all the human activities going on in the oceans. UNCLOS, as Professor Attard said, is a terrific legal instrument. You know, it was ahead of the curve at the time. But now the curve has moved on. Nobody in the 70s and 80s could, you know, envisage that men could be able to go down hundreds and thousands of meters on the seabed, in international waters, to pluck up all the raw materials that we need for our mobile phones, for our laptops. So now we need a new legal framework to actually protect those species which haven't yet been discovered. You know, so 95% of the biodiversity in the deep sea is still waiting to be discovered. So that is, I think, the perfect example of the precautionary principle. You're actually trying to discuss a universally accepted legal framework to protect something you still have to describe, to discover, and so on. You know, so I think the forum was an excellent way to bring around the same table entities like FAO, entities like BBNJ, the EU Commission. The EU Commission operates, manages the largest EEZ in the world. Why? Because Europe has a lot of offshore territories, namely Britain, France, and so on. So it has a large chunk of the EEZ. Malta is also part of the Commonwealth. 46 out of 53 small island developing states are part of the Commonwealth. So we're excellently placed to lead this global forum, this global discussion on how we can bring everybody who has a role in the BBNJ, and here I have to give credit as well to the excellent role played by the International Ocean Institute. The audience here, we have Professor Ronnie Benham, who's the honorary president of IOI, okay, along with Emily and all the other institutes we have at the university and in Malta. These entities have played a leading role in obviously forwarding the principles of UNCLOS and to stay ahead of the curve. So I obviously am, and I'll close with this, I'm heartened to hear Minister Abela this morning say that Malta is interested to hold obviously the next forum here in Malta, and this will obviously be an excellent opportunity to keep Malta up there along with the other key players to drive the process forward.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Carmel Nguanes, soon to be ambassador to Paris. Your ambassador designate actually already, and former permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Nguanes has a very long CV, very experienced in different countries. I almost made a list, but I'm sure that everyone would be able to read the CV. Your latest position in the United Nations has sensitized you to the key challenges that are faced by the UN when it comes to multilateralism. Which are the key challenges, and are you optimistic that they can be surmounted?
Okay, thank you. Those of you who have had the occasion to be at the United Nations and have gone up to the 3rd floor, there is one particular corridor where there is an inscription on the wall which states that the United Nations was created not to take humankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And this inscription, this quotation is very, very relevant. It was relevant when it was placed, and it is more relevant now. It shows the limitations, what we can do, what we cannot do, and in some way it puts the framework of our work. There is no doubt for anyone who has been working in international relations to say that the world has become more dangerous and perhaps less predictable. And there are various causes for this. There are populism, extremism, pandemics, global challenges. It's ironic that the more we have global challenges, the less the global community collectively is engaged. And I see myself, but I share this view with many others who have worked at the UN, that there are, these couple of years, it was developed safety mechanisms that previously were in place, where in some way now, in some ways, they have been weakened. And the safety mechanisms, if I have to group them, they are, to my mind, there are 3 safety mechanisms. The first safety mechanism is that relates to that there is no more major power, especially among the P5, who are in agreement or willing to agree to be the force of last resort to implement international order. sorry, there is more and more less appetite to agree. And this results in one major power takes over the other. This is very dangerous for multilateralism. More so, there is, in my view, less appetite for the United Nations as an organization to stand on its own feet. Because, as we know, the United Nations is a member state-driven organization. It's an intergovernmental organization. But still, the Secretary General, according to the Charter of the United Nations, has a mandate to do certain things. The second safety mechanism, which to me seems to be weakening, is the fact that there is a weakening system of international governance, even, unfortunately, at the UN level. There is a weakening of transparency, and more so, which is very fundamental to us, a weakening of accountability. And we have seen several instances. I do not want to go into international politics, but there are several spots in the world, spots of conflict, where accountability is missing. The third safety mechanism, which I have seen during the past 3.5 years that I have been in New York, that it has been weakened and it has been less and less common and coming to the forefront, is across the board, the whole group of countries, 193 countries, the less willingness, the less concert to reach a common ground, basically on most things that previously we were very comfortable to reach common ground upon. I think these three factors, of course, there is a fundamental factor behind these three factors. These three factors amount to the major challenge that the multilateral system and UN as its epitome is facing. The underlying factor is that more and more countries are excluding global interest from their national interest. And national interest is not dictated by global interest. And I think every country, big and smaller countries in particular, should factor in global interests in their national foreign policies. How can we get out of this this problem that we are facing, and it's aggravating, I must say? We are doing several things at the UN, and the international community is doing, of course, several things to try to redress this approach of going through, separate ways. The first measure that we have been taking was taken by the Secretary General, in effect, which is the reform process of the United Nations, which all the member states support to various degrees, but all of us support this reform process. A reform process which sees the United Nations to be more nimble, hopefully more efficient, and more effective. A reform process which is based on three pillars: the security pillar, the development system, and the management system, because of the UN. Because it must be said that there is a lot of good, and the United Nations, no doubt, is essential, but there is very much need to curtail the big elephant that we are. Then there are two processes which unfortunately one of them is finding a big difficulty in moving forward, especially after 75 years of our establishment. The process of the Security Council reform. We have been debating and debating, and things somewhat stand at a standstill. And the other one is moving, but not as fast as we would like it to move. And this is the revitalization process of the General Assembly. As you know, we have another charter body, which is ECOSOC, and ECOSOC and the second committee of the General Assembly, which is a main committee, we have been a lot criticized that there are a lot of teams which have been overlapping, duplicating themselves, and a lot of resources are being dispersed on some topics which should have been dealt with one entity. The revitalization process has been going on year after year, like the Security Council reform. These are all efforts to try to put the United Nations into a more firm position to lead the way for multilateralism. But of course, we have to be autocritical to try to improve and better the multilateral system. And there is a lot of criticism by some member states that, and legitimately so, I must say, that the revitalization process itself needs revitalization, because we say a lot of things, but when it comes to implementation, we implement a little, and we find stumbling blocks among member states which have agreed previously to do this and that. When it comes to the Security Council reform, this is a very fundamental and crucial issue. There is the claim that we've heard this morning that some countries need to be at the table but not at the menu, in the menu. More than that, there are other countries which think and which advocate to have a permanent seat. And all this would complicate matters with the veto power. And I do not want to deal with this because this is a highly political and sensitive issue. But the fact of the matter is that there is, acceptance by all that the United Nations today does not represent well its membership. It is not that much of a democratic organization. It is not transparent. There are all these criticisms facing us. And we need to reform the Security Council to be able to have a United Nations which truly reflect this century, 21st century. I think these are all efforts which we try. In some ways we are successful, in some not, but we try to do so as to bring multilateralism again to the forefront.
Thank you, Ambassador. I found your answer intriguing in the sense that inefficiencies, the lack of transparency, the democratic deficit, etc., in most organizations is often underlined. That is what we hear in the media, for instance. But the achievements are hardly ever registered. And this, in a way, is one of the problems, because media organizations, well, in the 1920s, the founder of BBC, Sir John Reed, said that the role of the media should be to inform, to educate, and to entertain. Now it's the other way around. There's a lot of entertainment and very little information, and media organizations tend to avoid complex issues, processes that unfold over a long period of time, issues that are not very sexy for the public in general, but and in a way, people are not really, publics are not really informed, perhaps. And I keep wondering whether multilateral organizations, whether they're engaging in public diplomacy efforts that give, very clear messages that somehow underline the positive benefits of these organizations and that promote the values of the organizations. I would like to take some questions from the floor now before we proceed.
If I can add one comment on what you said, which is very relevant, is that we have a problem of communications. And this is why the Secretary General of the United Nations have invested a lot in a global communication strategy. Because really, there is a lot of good in the United Nations when it comes to peacekeeping, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to migration, when it comes to all global challenges. But the perception out there is that we have not agreed, the Security Council has not agreed on a particular resolution. So the Security Council is blocked, the United Nations is blocked. And this is only part of the story. The press, either conveniently or not, I don't know, perhaps they are not fed this narrative, this positive narrative. And this is what we're trying to do ourselves, to try to ameliorate the public image, the image of the United Nations. I'm sorry for taking the floor again.
No, it's okay. And actually, even at a European level, there is this issue. Someone once said that there is the Brusselsization of problems, but the nationalization of achievements. And this probably also is applicable to most other international organizations as well. So, questions from the floor? Yes? Can you please identify yourself?
I'm Behnam. I'm the honorary president of the International Ocean Institute. I have been a diplomat, a UN diplomat for 33 years. And I would like to first convey some comments on the ambassadors. I've been in one organization first, which was called UNCTAD. You don't even recall now what UNCTAD is. And I saw Secretary General after Secretary General that comes, the first thing he says, reform. And on the top in UN, every time we have a Secretary General, we say reforms. But how did this process of reforms really take? It wasn't about waste, it wasn't about economies, it was about disagreement on issues and programs on the mandate of the organization that the big powers did not like. So we had a great division on the shipping division, which was dealing for the first time with the economic and commercial aspect of shipping. It's not standards. And as part of the reform, it was abolished. We had a technology division, which for 12 years negotiated a code of conduct for the transfer of technology, which was mandated in UNCLOS. What happened? 12 years, and then they closed the division. And 12 years of negotiations was wasted. Similarly, on the transnational code of conduct, and 13 years of negotiations closed down with the mandate. And then this continued every time. It's reform, reform, reform. What we ended up with an organization that cannot even legislate and cannot even have recommendations in a report that the UN spends money and time and our efforts to formulate. So there is this truth about how the politics of the big countries force changes in programs they don't like. And that has been going on and has never stopped. I've experienced it as a UN diplomat, as a Swiss with diplomat status in the UN, and never changes.
Thank you.
To my question just to the rector, the honorable rector, what are the choices that we have? Review UNCLOS or have instruments that deal with the current issues of climate change under UNCLOS? Thank you.
Any other points? Okay.
Hi, I'm Majid from IMLI. First, the world should appreciate Maltese role for two milestone world-changing initiative. First, Common Heritage of Humankind by Mr. Pardo, and second, efforts by for climate change by Professor Attard, also the role of IMLI. And regarding that, my question is that in 1988, climate change was addressed as a future or common problem, future problem. But now in 2019, and we are reaching 2020, it is more of an imminent and even tangible threat. So in your idea, what can be done further? And do we need another initiative, or what world is waiting for? Thank you.
No.
All right. Okay. One last question. Okay. Over here. And then it's lunchtime.
Hi, Daniel Massa, Second Secretary, Ministry for Foreign Affairs. First of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists today for the very thought-provoking discussion which we've had so far. In the previous remarks by the Honourable Minister, it was mentioned that he quoted Secretary General Kofi Annan saying how important multilateralism is today, and it's been on the agenda for quite some time. My question is about the ongoing wave of populism in Europe and even beyond Europe towards the international scene. And my question is, with the challenges that we are faced with nowadays, how effective is multilateralism truly? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've had these three questions, and then just pick on which aspect you would like to elaborate. May I add one other question? My question is that non-state actors are important in multilateralism, and we've discussed the role of civil society in the previous panel, academia, but what about businesses, global businesses, which are at times more powerful than some states? What sort of input do they have, and what sort of role do they have, and can we rope them in these efforts which we are discussing today? Professor Attard, shall we start with you?
Well, perhaps I could address the question by the President of IOI. Amend UNCLOS. Well, the amendment procedures in UNCLOS are extremely burdensome, almost impossible. And the reason for that was the determination of the developing states to ensure that the common heritage of mankind in Part 11 is secure, particularly in the face of American opposition to the Maltese proposal on common heritage of mankind. And therefore, it's quite fascinating to see the efforts that were made at the conference to ensure that the primacy of the principle of common heritage is protected. In the first place, this treaty, which has over 300 provisions, does not allow for reservations. So you must either accept the package deal or do like some states have done, don't join. It's rather interesting because This, in effect, means that the convention is very difficult to amend, I would say. If you look at the amendment provisions, it's almost impossible. In fact, what has happened, and at IMLI we have conducted a worldwide research program with about 69 experts, and actually have had it published recently by OUP, and that is that we have now a considerable amount of fragmentation. That is, what you have are treaties relating to the law of the sea, but developing outside UNCLOS. So you have a treaty on Part 11, the final compromise, which, although was agreed to by the Clinton administration, still the US is not a party to the 82 Convention. You have the straddling stocks, and now you'll have the BBNJ Convention. Now, these are all developing parallel. In addition to this, you have over 50 international maritime treaties adopted by the IMO, and literally hundreds of regulations, again, all outside the framework of UNCLOS. And then you have the regional sea programs, you have the UNEP conventions. So we have a fragmentation. And this raises the point now of where does climate protection come within this whole sphere. I think initially, as was suggested by Ambassador Doon, the idea was not so much importance to the ocean aspect, but now there's such an intimate interdependency between the two that you can't really succeed in one or the other without protecting both. And therefore, I think that the climate change process will more and more look towards ocean protection, but not via amending UNCLOS. Could be protocols, could be side agreements, but in my view, amending UNCLOS is impossible. The good news, of course, is that IMO is moving quite fast. In 2020, there will be the sulfur directive. And within the IMO, that's a regulatory process. There you have real obligations that have to be taken into account by the shipping industry. So I think that it is not possible to amend UNCLOS. I think that you really have to look at a parallel development of treaties.
Thank you, Professor Attard. Professor Deidoun?
Yes, I'll touch on 2 points. So I'll start with your question about industry. How far do we go with involving industry? Obviously, industry is an important stakeholder, so we are speaking about different stakeholders and so on. So, and obviously multilateralism is about reaching consensus and so on. So you cannot leave industry out of the room. The million-dollar question is obviously, where do you draw the line? Because obviously there are commercial interests involved, and one would have to be careful, obviously, of vested interests, of lobbies and so on. But definitely, because you need to involve industry, even the amount of funding that one can leverage through industry. So nowadays, just to take an example from what is happening at the EU, the next funding program of the EU after Horizon 2020 is obviously Horizon Europe. And in Horizon Europe, which will be for the next programming period for 2020-21 till 2027, the European Commission is looking at a different model where they involve more and more industry. So your question is very pertinent, very relevant, and so we need to involve more industry. But obviously the tricky question is where to find the balance between public good and obviously the vested interests, because that is the one has to be careful, but definitely. So coming back to the multilateralism part question from the audience, from the floor, what were their vehicles we can use for multilateralism, and if multilateralism can succeed, and so on. Coming back to my pet subject, obviously the ocean is one of the best vehicles as a soft diplomatic tool, because obviously there is this commonality about the ocean. So speaking about the ocean tends to remove boundaries and remove, boundaries which may separate two parties and so on. In fact, last month we had a very good session at the Paris Peace Forum, where the ocean was represented. You might say, what does the ocean have to do with global peace? But if you have to think of it, there's very few things on Earth which are common to humans as the ocean. So the ocean could be quite a vehicle, And just to conclude, I'm also heartened by the fact that the next decade, UN decade, is dedicated to the ocean. So we are on the verge of the Ocean Sciences Decade, which will kick off probably in Lisbon at the One Ocean Conference next June. In the past, UN decades have always been about development, largely about development. If you have to look at the past UN decades, they were mainly dedicated to development and so on. So to actually dedicate, a decade to ocean sciences, I think it says a lot. And we might not be aware that Europe has placed the ocean as one of its 5 key priorities. So the 5 key priorities for the European Commission through its mission boards are social mobility, soil and food production, you've got cancer, you've got climate change, and you've got the ocean. Up till 10, 15 years ago, nobody would have dreamt, the ocean was a marginal issue, but now the ocean finally made it to the main table.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Ambassador Nguane.
a few points in reply to the floor, the several remarks. First of all, to you, Prorector, about industry. It has to be said that the first Climate Action Summit, which happened in September, had seen the involvement of the private sector, the business sector, in the knowledge and in acknowledgement that if we don't have the business sector on board, we cannot achieve our targets. So this is one major step for the United Nations to involve fully fledged in the summit, in its summit itself, in its proceedings. Business sectors who support this push and who made real pledges, not only of support, of what to do to reduce the carbon levels, etc. With regards to His Excellency's remark about reform, etc., one has to remember that I agree completely with you. Every Secretary General comes with a reform package. This is a known fact. For me, personally speaking, reform for reform doesn't make sense, but it has to be reform for more efficiency. And efficiency should result in doing more with less. So this is my dictum in my mind. The General Assembly has about 170 items on the agenda this session. And it produces about 300 resolutions, the General Assembly only. This is apart from the ECOSOC, apart from the Security Council. And out of those 300 resolutions, there are many which are annually just a technical rollover. We just do. And it was our proposal, Malta's proposal. We're still working on it in the General Committee, being Malta now occupies one of the vice presidencies of the General Assembly. And in one of the meetings of the General Committee, I spoke in favor of rationalizing these resolutions, and in a way that we classify them between static and dynamic. There are resolutions, for example, regarding women and girls in science, which comes every year, which we debate every year, which we open the Pandora box. Nobody knows who will say something which would unravel the whole text every year. This is a static resolution in contrast with a dynamic resolution, which, for example, sees the human rights progress in a particular country. That, in that case, we need to revisit, but not in these cases. We've put forward this idea. It has been taken up by the General Committee. Hopefully, we will reach agreement on it. One point is that whatever we do and I close with this, Prorector, is whatever we do in the United Nations, this is member states driven. So we criticize the UN for being too large, for doing a lot of things, maybe with little effect, with more effect. But we forget that it is us. The burden is us. The fault lies among member states who produces a cumbersome mechanism, for example, to simply do a declaration. They do a modalities resolution and then a resolution on the content of the declaration. 2 co-facilitators. It becomes enormous. It becomes, a slow-moving elephant in itself. So we conveniently forget that this is the result of our own doing, member states doing. Thank you.
I would like to thank the panelists for these very interesting insights. And now we move on to the last part of this conference.
So, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on such an engaging topic. So thank you very much, Professor Carmen Samut, Prorector and Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Malta, Professor David Attard, Director at the International Maritime Law Institute, Ambassador Alan Deidoun, Malta's Ocean Ambassador, and Ambassador Carmelo Inguanes, former Permanent Representative of Malta at the United Nations in New York and Ambassador Designate of Malta to France. So, it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Norbert Bugeja, Senior Lecturer at the University of Malta, to share with us his reflections and conclusions on what we have been listening to this morning. Norbert.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by saying 2 things. I am not a diplomat, so I'm an academic and a humanistic academic for that matter. So we've been very much critical of exclusivism, basically across the debates we listened to today. So the fact that you're very cordially accepting my presence here testifies to your readiness to diversify your listenership.
Am I close?
Okay, so I'd like to sort of interlink immediately a comment that was made by Ambassador Inguanes, the last speaker, and Mr. Zerbo, the first speaker, where the question of the need for a good communication strategy arose. And I'd like to link that with the fact that Mr. Zerbo spoke about the question of erosion of trust, because I really feel that mutual trust and good communication go hand in hand. We cannot have one without the other. And this is, I think, very true of the challenges that we are facing. Mr. Zerbo spoke of this moment of interconnectedness, of new media, of new communications tools as existing against this background of an erosion of trust and of disinformation campaigns. And I think this is an important cue for us to think about new ways of how we can protect the space of public discourse and the space of public debate. I've in other fora spoken of higher education institutions, for instance, as crucial spaces for the rethinking of how online media and social media today are configuring public debate. Public debate is also a matter of sustainability. I think that the space of public debate is something that needs to be protected through legislation, possibly, but also has to be made sustainable and has to be also left as a matter of legacy. So even when we think, these are all matters that are interlinked. We have climate change, we have the question of disarmament, we have the question of a healthier space of public debate. All of these matters need in many ways to be thought of as in terms of legacy. Mr. Zerbo spoke also of disarmament. I mean, my job here is to make a brief resume of what's been debated. And disarmament very much raises the question of Libya. It is a subject matter after my heart also because I researched some aspects of what is going on in Libya. And the multilateral solution for disarmament, I think Libya is a text case for this urgency to move towards disarmament through and only through a multilateral solution. Regional institutional building, I think, was also a very important point to be raised. And regional institutional building is a matter that makes me think very often of culture, and culture as the remaining common language, as the main common language in my view of the Mediterranean region especially. I think that in terms of culture, we need to diversify our ways of listening to the different communities in the Mediterranean. I've done some research, for instance, in Tunisia with NGOs, literacy NGOs like Tunis Wal Kitab, and you begin to realize that there are platforms, social platforms, that have a strong moral clout in their communities, that have strength within their constituencies, but little resources. And I think our foreign policy should be further geared towards empowering these existing platforms. With regard to the women, peace and security discussion, the point was raised that we are a long way from achieving the ideal in terms of equality and empowerment, but that we cannot think of equality and empowerment without thinking of their indispensability to face the challenges of extremism, of armed conflict, of refugees, of internally displaced persons. So empowerment, equality, and the major issues we are facing go hand in hand. And again, there isn't one without the other. A takeaway from the panel on women, peace and security was the relationship that I find between academia and empowerment, academia and policymaking. I think that we're still far away from creating the right structures for policymakers to be able to tap into the existing resources of academia in order to create policies that actually connect and improve the lives of communities. Very often I read policies and I think, yes, but if the people behind this policy were actually aware of specific case studies on the ground within the region, this would actually be a much more effective policy. So sometimes policymakers drive the agenda, sometimes constituencies on the ground, vice versa, drive the agenda of policymakers, and we need to find that middle space where we can mediate effectively. I feel that there are many resources in scholarship with regard to regional understanding that continue to be untapped. The effort at peace building is, as Dr. Kaki said earlier, inevitably political, and I think we need to have greater awareness and a greater need to create encounter between the political demands of constituencies and diplomatic discourse, lawmaking and policy making. Okay, I was jotting these down along the way, so you have to bear with me as I sift through the points. Yeah, basically I was also very interested in the question of of awareness. I think that these key points, education, awareness, empowerment, emerged very strongly in the second panel. It becomes more of a matter of how to implement and how to facilitate. With regard to the last panel, I was very interested in what Professor Attard the point he raised about sovereignty, that sovereignty can no longer be used as a facade. And this links to the whole discourse of exclusivism. I think one of the most important ways to overcome the frontiers of exclusivism is by creating stronger people-to-people platforms. And again, I feel that the cultural becomes very important here. Climate change, climate justice will not only remain a scientific perspective, but we also have to think through the cultural implications of climate justice, for instance, and build platforms for dialogue on that basis. I think that's all from my end, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bugeja, for your pertinent observations and remarks. I would also like to thank all the other speakers that have been with us today. We had the honor to listen to you, to engage with you. I would also like to thank my dear colleagues who have worked hard. Their dedication and hard work have made this symposium possible. Dear friends, colleagues, discussions don't need to stop just because a symposium is over. Of course, let's continue engaging with each other and exchanging views over lunch, which is being served at the Menhir restaurant downstairs. There will be staff guiding you to the designated area, which we will commandeer this afternoon. I thank you for your attendance on behalf of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion of Malta, and wish you all a very nice day. Thank you very much.